and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today we say hello to Mike Amundsen. Hey Mike, how are you doing?
We're not getting APIs to work, are we?
We'll try. We'll see how we can get them to work in a better way. So today we're actually announcing our upcoming series. Today is the pilot of What Would the Web Do? The idea is we'll talk about rethinking enterprise architecture, reframing some of the things that typically happen in enterprise architecture and looking at them from the angle of what you might see on the web. And Mike and myself, we've talked about that for, I think, a very long time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All the time, for years,
Oh.
right? More than a decade. Absolutely.
All the time for years. That's probably true. So what do you find interesting when you think about that thought process of looking at enterprise architecture and comparing it to web architecture?
Yeah, so as we've talked before, I spent decades in the enterprise space of one type or another. That's really always been my home, and that's always been where I've worked. At the same time, I'm constantly fascinated and trying to learn more about the web and how the web works. And in many ways, they're similar, but in several key ways, they operate very, very differently, from a closed system to an open system, from top-down control to distributed control. So I love this idea of rethinking what we think enterprise architecture is about, especially as enterprises get larger and larger. I think they need to adopt more and more of the sort of the ethos and the culture and the patterns and practices of the web, which is, massively large globally. So I think rethinking this is a great opportunity to just talk about interesting topics like services and APIs and platforms and documents and data and all these things, and rethinking about how enterprises use them today into a way that might be more webby. So that's kind of been my background, and that's what I want to bring to the discussion.
Yeah, I like the point that you made about it's getting larger. I think that's the fascinating part, right? With the API economy and more dependencies and more IT getting used all the time, I think it's just that enterprise computing is getting closer and closer to kind of web scale and web dependency kind of things. And that for me is the fascinating part of that.
And you come from, you've done all of this, right? You come from the industrial side, the industry side, academic side, web. You've kind of gotten involved in all of these spaces as well, right?
Yes, I came into it. So I wrote this book. It's an actual book.
It's a book. It's a real book.
How does the web work? It's very old by now. It's over 20 years old. But it's fascinating. Back then, I worked at a university and I wrote the book because there was no good book available that just explained how the web works. So I thought, well, that would be an interesting thing to do. So I wrote the book and I learned everything I could about how the web works. And then quite a while later, I left academia and kind of went into the corporate world and learned more about enterprise computing and enterprise architecture. And until this day, sometimes I see how things are getting done in enterprise architecture and computing, and I'm just confused. It's like, why would you do it this way? There are maybe better ways to do that. But one example just was ESPs, right? The first time when somebody explained to me what an ESP is, I thought, oh, it's a bus. That sounds like a good idea. And then they explained to me how it works, and I thought, that's horrible. It's like it's not a bus. And it has it's like as centralized as you can possibly make things. So it was really one of these moments where I thought that, yeah, there's potential. That's how I like to do.
Yeah, and I think
there's a lot of potential.
That's a very similar way, the way I thought about it too, right? So I really started my web experience as a hobbyist, like way back, even before the World Wide Web. On boards and internet channels and stuff like this, IRC. So I sort of learned, this is how this stuff works. I mean, it's a bit disorganized, it's a bit confused, but we all sort of agree on the basics and we get a lot done. We get connected, we can find things and discover things and keep track of things. And then when I start working in industry, it's like, no, it can't be disorganized. It can't be freewheeling. It has to be well established and well controlled. And of course, there are pluses to all of this, right? So seeing how both of these sort of parallel tracks have gone over the last several decades, I don't even want to say how long I've been doing it, but is really, really been fascinating to me. And as you're saying, especially in the API space where you and I have worked with API Academy and so many other things over the last several years, it's getting so much closer to the way the web worked. What would the web be doing? If I was working on the web, how would I design this? How would I make this work? So I think we're being sort of almost sort of mashed together. It's like a mashup of the web culture, web technology, and the enterprise culture, enterprise technology. And I think it's a really critical time to start talking about how these two compare to each other.
And I love like when I proposed to do this, it said, hey, we should be doing a series that's called what would the web do, right? Like it didn't take you a second to say, yes, we should do this.
No. Yeah, we should definitely be doing this because it's what I deal with all the time.
So let's have a little teaser. So we already have a list of topics that we want to cover, but we won't reveal that list, but we will reveal the first topic that we will cover next week, which is microservices. So let's talk briefly about the kind of stuff that we want to talk about and how this idea of comparing enterprise architecture and the web architecture, how that applies to microservices.
Yeah, so I mean, right away, what I think about are these sort of independent elements that need to have some kind of loose connection to each other so they can be enlisted, maybe to solve a bigger problem. This, to me, sounds exactly like the way websites work, right? I can create a website, you create a website, I suddenly just create a link to you, suddenly we're connected in some way. I can like write a document that says, if you want to learn more about, how the web works, check out Eric's book, blah, blah, blah. So we have this sort of discoordinated activity already. So what I love about microservices is it starts to look to me like these independent little islands of information that we can connect. But boy, making that connection and making services interact with each other is super complicated compared to just putting a link on a page, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. There's more stuff around it, but definitely when I learned about microservices, and that was actually when I joined API Academy, right? When we started working together for a while. And when I learned about microservices, the one thing that fascinated me was that this is one of the relatively few cases where I thought, oh, nice, that looks like a reasonable way of approaching things, right? It's like making sure that what you write is self-contained, individually deployable, right? Doesn't have more dependencies than you need to have. Yep. And I always thought that that's a pretty nice way of approaching that particular issue. But I think there's still, like you say, there's still a couple of things where you can think like, well, do we really need to do it that way, right? So the whole kind of like container fetish right now, that's the question: do we actually need to do that all the time? But since this is just a teaser, this is just the kind of stuff we'll be talking about.
Yep, exactly. Just a little bit of a teaser. There's all sorts of things that we could talk about just in the ecosystem of microservices and ecosystem, the landscape, same kind of things that you've been talking about for years. We've got a lot that we can cover, so we'll touch on that in our next episode, right?
In our first regularly scheduled episode, right. Yes. So I think we cover kind of the motivation pretty well. So I'm really looking forward to kind of run this, I would say, open-ended series. I don't think we'll ever run out of material.
I won't.
Yeah, same here. So everybody, please kind of join us. We'll start doing these things hopefully on a regular basis. We'll try to do it weekly. Probably it won't work every week, but that's what we hope to be able to do. Next week will be the first one on microservices, and we already have a couple of other topics that we have lined up. So I think it's going to be an interesting discussion every single time.
Yeah, you bet. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.